Hola, this is Ed Cabrera bringing to you our latest presentation from lifelong learners of the Central Coast. Today's topic, why are we a divided nation? Now, this is a thought by such a large majority in our population. I thought it was worth discussing. I am going to call on the help of so many people who have in the past donated their time and ideas to this project, because I'm not an expert. I am not the academic of our other presenters. I'm simply someone that brings an idea forward, researches it, and gives it to you for your consideration. One of our contributors, I will share with you now. We have to look to see how we got here. Now, these ideas, these theories are not necessarily mine. They are present in two magazine articles, one written by David Blankenhorn, a contributor to the American Interest. He had 14 causes of political polarization. And another pair of authors gave their 2 cents in a magazine article in the Washington Post, a newspaper article in the Washington Post. They added their own 10 reasons. Now there's some crossover, there's some duplication here, so I'm not going to present 24 reasons. These two articles were brought to me, to my attention by the Reverend Brian Walker. Thank you, Brian. So they're going to represent their ideas. I'm going to look into them a little more deeply for you. But we're going to begin in a more lighthearted fashion, because I want to characterize the two sides. Sometimes we'll use conservative and liberal, other times we'll use Democrat and Republican, almost a changeover, even though they're not necessarily the same thing. Question I have for you, this question would take 20 minutes to half an hour if I were in a high school classroom. It's going to only take you seconds to discuss and to think about. What kind of car do you drive? Would you believe me if I told you that social scientists have delved deeply into this question with surveys and scholarly exercises? And their answers are, well, if you're a Democrat, now this is going to be almost stereotypical generalization, they drive foreign cars, small foreign cars, whereas Republicans tend to purchase a domestic model, a Detroit original. If it's the type of car that you're talking about, Democrats, liberals tend to choose at the dealership sedans, hybrids, more family oriented, and of late, electric vehicles. If you're Republican, you tend to buy the larger automobile, a more of a family vehicle, a more of an exotic vehicle, and of course, luxury items. But the liberal side, the Democratic side, does also buy the luxury items, but they tend to be more foreign. Whereas the Republican buyer will opt also for a foreign car, a Land Rover or Lexus, but also combine it with more of a luxury type automobile. Because so much of the demographic on the left is young, they tend to buy used cars. Whereas the other side of the spectrum more likely will be driving a truck, a large truck. As my wife would say, probably driven by a male. Now, let's get some more comparisons. It's the lighthearted side, it's the fun side before we start getting to more heavy subjects. These social scientists have also said if you can almost determine whether someone is on one side of the spectrum or not just by the way they dress. If you visit their homes, you can make an an identification relatively early, ask if they read fiction versus nonfiction. Guess which one reads more nonfiction? Scientists say it's the conservatives. They even have different destinations for the recreation time. And of course, they will choose different alcoholic beverages. And what happens as a result of this? Well, armed with this knowledge, you can identify these people on the either side of the spectrum. And sometimes people make decisions based on the way that they live. You ask any Prius owner of some time, and now it's the Tesla owner, in that they often are targets for people who do not like the choices that they have made, because they feel that the other side thinks that this represents a way of thinking. Let's delve farther into this subject. Here are the top 10 retail sites for conservative Republicans. Now, it's interesting. Now, I'm sure when you're looking at this, you're asking yourself, wow, I like some of these places. Well, this is not totally exclusive. This is not going to brand you on one side or the other. They're just discussing tendencies. And to prove my point, you see Crate and Barrel on the top right-hand side as being a favorite of conservative Republicans. Well, it's also on the left side. So rest assured, you can breathe easily now. But I'm also looking at some of these outfits, and wouldn't you agree with me that San Luis Obispo tends to be more of a liberal town with liberal inhabitants? And it's no coincidence that we have a Forever 21 and we have an H&M, for example, in our city limits. Simmons research goes into it even more deeply. Where can you go in the Central Coast without coming across a Starbucks? And here again, maybe it's representative of the way we think politically. Never heard of a Bojangles, so I can't tell you one way or the other what they represent or what they even sell. Obviously, it's coffee or fast food. I'm sorry. Would you believe they even go into the type of cat food that either side prefers? Not being a cat owner, can't really comment on that. I just find it interesting that they would go that deeply. My kids opted for Vans early in life, and maybe it's another comment about San Luis Obispo that our Clark's outlet no longer is in business in town. When it comes to home computers, there's one for us Mac owners, or maybe you would prefer to be on the other side, but that's what the Simmons people determined from their surveys, that a Mac person tends to be on the left side of the spectrum. If you're an Old Navy person, here again, a slow business, you find yourself on the left side of the spectrum. And if you have an iPhone in your pocket, well, then that's just an indicator that you are running around with your tribe. But interestingly enough, Coors is the choice of either. So if you want to arrange a truce, may I suggest that you order and serve Coors for your guests. When it comes to grocery stores, again, we have a Trader Joe's here in this county, don't have a Sam's Club. Are we trending in a certain direction here? We also have a California Pizza Kitchen downtown near the Central Cinemas. No Cracker Barrel. I always thought that that name itself would probably refer to one side or the other. A department store. We do have the H&M, as I referred to earlier. Always love the Newmans. And it's interesting that they supported certain causes on the left, and perhaps that's why they are the darling of the left. Hey, we're talking about numbers. We're talking about numbers. People say, it's not to be concerned, because there's a whole school of thought that says this whole polarization thing is overblown. It's fake news. And here is a graph they might use to prove their point. You see, it's only 6% on the far right and only 8% on the far left. The vast majority of people, moderate people, can talk to each other and don't have that great of difference. You can be lulled into some sort of peace by the low percentages. 6% of the American population, we're not talking about a lot of people, or are we? Are we? The population of the United States, the latest population in the 2020 census was, let's round this up, 330 million people. Okay, 1% would be 3.3 million. Did I not say 6% was on the far right, according to that graph? Well, we're talking about close to 10 million people. So 6%, not worth attention. 10 million people definitely ought to grab your attention. But I don't want to be accused of being partisan. So let's look on the left side. It's even greater. It's 8%. So if it's 10 million on the far right, it's got to be even greater number on the far left. So people do say, hey, we're talking about close to 20 million people here who are on the extremes of the political platform. What do the two sides think of each other? Well, on the Democratic side, they think that Republicans are more closed-minded. 3/4 of Democrats think so. They're characterized as closed-minded people, Republicans. On the other side, it's popular for Republicans to point the finger at Democrats and call them unpatriotic. I found it curious down in the bottom right-hand corner that Democrats say, oh, we'll give you that. We'll give you that. We consider 19% of the Democrats say we will consider you patriotic, but very few Republicans return the compliment. So this is the lighthearted part of the presentation. And I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of you watching this presentation, the vast majority of Americans will say they love their country. That's not the challenge. The challenge is, so let's talk about the subject areas covered by the three authors. The areas they identified as reasons for polarization: the end of the Cold War, the rise of identity politics, how the parties have become so far apart, where has the money, the new money, coming from, and who's giving it. Also, the growing divide on the religious sector, the diversity that continues to grow in the United States. Where is it located? How is it divided? The divisive issue of immigration. Interestingly, not only the spread of media ghettos, but also the degradation of journalism. So let's begin with the end of the Cold War. I think most people recognize that as a starting point. No more Soviet Union, no more common enemy. Let's go back to something that's also going to be pointed out by one of my guests. It's a proverb by Bedouins: me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and my cousin against the stranger. So as the circle grows greater, if we identify a threat from the outside, that becomes our priority. Lacking that outside threat, then we turn it against each other. Now, the Cold War, it began as a team effort, a common enemy. Consequently, the fight received support from both sides of the aisle. But the dying days of the Cold War split us into two camps: the Hawk Party and the Dove Party. And that has only worsened over time. And since the parties are purified, they become more divisive. we're actually going to spend even more time on the purification of the parties. So yes, sometimes people say the common enemy now is terrorism, but since we're not talking about one country or one leader, it's so spread out. There's really no global enemy, and it lacks focus as a result. If you're looking at this chart, what this chart is graphing is polarization. When it dips, it lessens. When it climbs, it becomes greater. So if you're looking at this dip at the bottom line, you're talking about a timeline. It is the First World War, where there is less polarization. We have the common enemy in Europe. Consequently, we tend to work together. That continues through World War II and the Cold War. But as you can see in the far right, lacking a common enemy, it has polarization. The dark line is the House, the light line is the Senate. So as you can see, greater polarization in the House of Representatives. The first reason that the authors pointed out was the rise of identity group politics. So let's call on our first guest for his contribution to the question of identity group politics.
University should do. And so when we talk about identity politics, which is a controversial topic, we start by saying, of course you need identity politics. Identity politics is not a bad thing automatically. Politics can be based on any distinction. It can be based on any group interest. So for gay students or Black students or women to organize, that's identity politics. That's perfectly legitimate. The question is, how are they organizing? What's the overarching framework? And we've seen two versions of it in American history. You can do it the way most of the civil rights leaders did it, Martin Luther King in particular, where you draw a larger circle around the group, you emphasize what we have in common, and then you say, some of our brothers and sisters are being denied equal access, equal opportunity, or equal dignity. That works. That has worked historically in much tougher times and zones, and that works and will work on college campuses. The other way you do it, which is growing on college campuses, is common enemy identity politics. It's based on the Bedouin notion, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother and cousin against the stranger. It's a very general principle of social psychology. If you try to unite people, let's all unite against them. They're the bad people. They're the cause of the problems. Let's all stick together. That's a really dangerous thing to do in a multi-ethnic society, especially in a university where we're actually all trying to work together to solve the problem.
So, politics in which groups of people have a particular racial, religious, ethnic, social, or cultural identity. The problem becomes when they try to promote their own specific interests or concerns without regard. Us against them. That's often the downside of identity politics that irks people. Case in point, when we're talking about identity politics, yes, you can have an agenda that supports women, but sometimes people feel left out when they say, yes, that supports women, but does it support women of color? We're not being added to that drive, that fight. But then people say, whoa, wait a minute. How about women of color who are in dire economic straits? We are not being added to that. There is no emphasis on us. There's a final push that says, well, you're ignoring us. Women of color in economic subclasses who are disabled. So you can see where this almost has no end. And it's not a problem to have identity politics unless you point out that there is another side that is responsible for your situation and you make them the bad people and you put them in a defensive position. So there's been a shift. The unifying values of, let's say, civil rights to group identities where you have a very small group that is blaming another group for their situation. In a book called Political Tribes, Amy Chua says, the left believes that right-wing tribalism, bigotry, racism is tearing the country apart. The right believes that left-wing tribalism, identity politics, political correctness is tearing the country apart. And according to Ms. Chua, they are both right. Let's look at how the parties have grown farther apart. Here is our member of the House who represents Illinois, Brad Schneider. Maybe you've heard of this gentleman, Paul Gosar from Arizona. Well, they had a project which they teamed their efforts on. Laudable. They feel that leave should be granted to a parent who loses a child. Not too many people would disagree with that. Of course, the devil is in the details, but generally speaking, that is a noble, noble effort. All right. There's a little thing called January 6th that comes down the road. What happens to this team effort? Well, Mr. Schneider says, this is his quote, if you can't recognize the legitimacy of the election, the legitimacy of the new president, and you're unwilling to stop trafficking in the lies that led us to January 6th, then I'm not working with you. That was the threshold. On the other side, Mr. Gosar returns by saying, I will not work with toxic individuals who reject fair elections, engage in conspiracies and defamation, and disregard the will of the people. So what happens to the bill? It is dead in the water. These two gentlemen are no longer working with each other. Casualties of polarization. Let's look at the past. If you're looking at a party unity vote, that's when the parties come together and they vote according to party. In the 1960s, it was a minority of these votes that took place, only 42%. If we're talking about the 21st century, that number has risen. A large majority, 63%. Again, they vote on party lines. Let's look way back in history. If you're talking about major life-altering decisions made by Congress, the Social Security Act, not only did one party largely support it, the Democrats, 90%, they got the vast majority of the opposing party to support it. So it was definitely a bipartisan effort. I laugh when we get 55% of the vote today, or even 51% of the vote today, supporting a certain legislation and it's termed bipartisan, barely. Here's another major legislative effort, which I find really, really ironic because the Democrats often like to take credit for the Civil Rights Act, but look at the numbers. You got to remember the Dixiecrats in the South. And as a result, only 60% of the Democrats voted for the Civil Rights Act, whereas 75% of the Republicans did so. Team effort. Again, definitely bipartisan efforts. But let's flash forward to today. No Republican voted for Obamacare. But no Democrats voted for Trump's tax reform bill. So when we're looking at bipartisanship in the 21st century, all but dead. But we can point fingers at individuals if you like. You can point a finger at Newt Gingrich, because when he and the Republicans were ushered into office in the 90s, he began a new revolution. And I think it was payback for the fact that Democrats had dominated Congress, the House, for 40 years. Our friend Newt, one of his first changes was, it's too expensive to move to Washington. Stay at home. Even today, there are people who bunk together a very Spartan accommodations in Washington because it is expensive in Washington, but he made it a point to talk his colleagues and not to move into Washington. What does that have to do with anything? Well, because what happened is the calendar was made at the point where there was only 2 or 3 days of business going on per week. And as a result, people were flying out back to their home districts. And you say, oh, what's that got to do with anything? Well, what happens is that people have less time to fraternize. People have less time to reach across the aisle and form any friendship or relationship. He also changed the seniority system. Now, on the surface, this looks like a good change in that it's not the good old boy system where if you've been there for 50 years, you should be the honcho of a committee, right? But he used it as a weapon. So the people who were given these chairmanships had to display their loyalty to the party. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it became more partisan, did Congress. So now it wasn't about common sense. It wasn't about your diplomacy skills. It was about how loyal are you to your party. So once upon a time, believe it or not, there are some liberals amongst the Democratic Party and many more conservatives in the, liberals in the Republican Party and conservatives in the Democratic Party. So now they're much more pure, as pure, if not more pure, even since the time of the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction. Now, believe it or not, Republicans are more conservative than the Democrats are liberal, but they're less diverse. So you really have a hard time crossing the aisle to make a relationship. Because if you do, then what is going to happen? Well, your side is going to turn their backs on you. The opposite side, they might say, that was a brave, courageous thing to do, but will they vote for you in the next election? And when push comes to shove, will they have your back? Here's the poster child for this type of activity. She's being lionized by the left as being someone finally having to have the courage to choose country over party, but she's paid a heavy price. Her own party in Wyoming has kicked her out of the party, and it'll be a supremely interesting election in 2022, whether she can regain her seat. She took a noble cause. Will there be a big price to pay for it? So, what has happened? Delegates have been replaced by primaries. Isn't that a good thing? In that it's taken out of the hands of the individual, give it to the electorate. We're not seeing the big political machines of the past. Isn't that also a good thing? And what's the word for today? Transparency. So more smoky, smoke-filled back rooms where people are making those decisions. Everything is out in the open. And we're seeing newer faces. Consequently, we don't see the person who's been in a position for 40 or 50 years as often as we have in the past. And if we do, they don't wield that great amount of power that they did once upon a time. We're eliminating the person in the middle. Aren't they all good things? I would perhaps offer the idea that they may not be. And it was the also the opinion of the authors of the two articles that I mentioned. So what is the bottom line? What is the result? Well, the result is we get more representatives who are loud and extreme, as in our Marjorie Taylor Greene, who make the most noise, squeak the loudest, and consequently attract the most attention. Are they legislating or are they just pontificating? The authors point out the new political districts, gerrymandering. Now, since this is a graduate course, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on explaining gerrymandering, but this will be the short lesson on how it takes place.
Class, what we have here is a city district. These squares represent, we'll say, Republicans, and these circles represent the Democrats. Now, the Democrats want to crack the Republican vote. They would just do it like this. Okay, so you have this little one right here, little one right there, little one like that. And see, what we have here is they've diluted the Republican vote and absorbed it into the Democratic vote. So the Democrats would win each of those districts. That's called cracking. And you also have something that's called packing. Now, packing varies from cracking because with cracking, what you do, what we did was we broke it down. Packing, we're gonna clump it in. Maybe do this something like that, then come back up, and then voila, right? So what we've done is we've sacrificed this one district all for the sake of these other districts. You see what I'm saying? Now you have a greater chance of getting districts all around the one in the middle. So this is what politicians are doing to dilute votes from various communities around the country. And there you have it, cracking and packing. You just learned something. So what can we do to confront this affront to democracy? Well, here's a couple of ideas. One is take the humans out of the process entirely and leave it up to computers. We can write computer algorithms that ignore political data and draw district lines based on population size in neat and tidy shapes. None of this praying mantis nonsense. But not everyone's sold on this idea. How can we make sure that these districts are actually more fair or that they don't violate the Voting Rights Act? Another solution is to take redistricting out of the hands of politicians and give the power to the people. A few states, like California, have independent commissions in charge of redistricting. These bipartisan groups don't have any incentive to gerrymander. And this is actually how most other Western democracies do it. But all in all, it's still a struggle to determine how to draw lines that are the most fair. And now we want to hear from you. How does the practice of gerrymandering make you feel about casting a ballot in the future? What else do you want to know about this? Let us know in the comments below.
Gerrymandering is not illegal, by the way. Here's the definition again. For political advantage. So it's recognized that someone is going to gain an advantage. And it could be accidental, as in California, it is a bipartisan commission that decides. And there have already been charges that even though the Republicans on that committee, Democrats have gained the political advantage. You can redistrict to give minorities an advantage. That is legal. You cannot put them at a disadvantage. That would be illegal. All right, but it does contribute to polarization. Let's tell you how. First of all, if you are a candidate who's been put into a safe district, you think you're home free, right? Well, no, it depends on how loyal you are, again, to the agenda of the party. So if you are someone who's been with the party for a long time, but the party is going farther to the extreme side, and you are not with the agenda, you can lose your own primary. Now, whoever wins the primary is going to win the general election, but you first have to win the primary. Let me give you an example of who we're talking about. This gentleman is from New York, Joe Crowley. He'd been elected 10 times, so he'd served for 20 years. He had worked his way up to third man in charge, the Democratic caucus chair. So a safe bet, right? No, he lost his primary. Who did he lose his primary to? Well, probably someone you are familiar with. In fact, all I have to do is show you her picture and you know who we're talking about. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She unseated Joe Crowley. So I thought, you probably thought I was going to come up with an example on the right, but no, this is an example on the left where a person was not progressive enough and consequently lost their part. And they could blame it on gerrymandering because the vast majority of their people in their district were of their party. So she has come up with this agenda, which was too progressive for Mr. Crowley. And she convinced her constituents that she was the right person to get that agenda done. If you look at this chart, what it tells you is that once upon a time, just as recent as 1998, there were 164 swing states or swing seats in the House. What that means is that it could be a toss-up. It could be a toss-up. 123 safe seats on the left, 148 safe seats on the right, but it would be competitive in the middle in 164 races. But what's happened in 2014? We only have 90 competitive races now. So again, gerrymandering has caused polarization. We have new monies in elections. And the key word in this chart here is dark. Dark refers to money that does not have to be reported as it had been in the past. We're talking about $1 billion that is coming forth that was not necessarily a part of the scene in the past in elections. Why has this come about? Well, here's a chart showing you the decisions rendered by the Supreme Court that have affected spending, how much, and by whom on campaigns. Okay, we'll spotlight some of them. But before we do that, let me point out that these decisions were very close. And oftentimes it was the conservative judges versus the liberal judges, and that's how they fell on the subject. Let's spotlight Buckley versus Vallejo. The bottom line to this is that independent expenditures cannot be capped. Cannot be capped. In the past, there were, on the part of the FEC, limits on how much money could be spent. But it was Katie bar the door in 1976. All of a sudden, the caps are removed. Not on the whole, but enough to make a big difference. The FEC was challenged by Citizens United, and as a result, corporations can now spend directly on campaigns, and that opened the door to large spending on the part of corporations. Another close decision on the part of the Supreme Court in 2010. The most recent decision that is affecting this issue is McCutcheon versus FEC. And here's where an overall spending on a federal campaigns can't be capped. So you might have a cap on your local, but not on your federal campaigns. And even though once upon a time, the popular saying was all politics are local, that has changed. We'll explain that further in a minute. Here are the number of federal PACs. You can see how they have grown ever since those decisions. This decision in 1974 prompted this growth all the way up to almost 5,000 federal PACs. PACs mean political action committees that were formed to primarily get people elected or to support causes. Here's how the businesses break down. Banks, Wall Street are the biggest donors, and interestingly enough, to Republicans. Of late, the Republicans often love to point their finger at Wall Street and say, we're not beholden to Wall Street and high finance, I think this chart would show you that that is not necessarily so. And it's also interesting on the far right, energy prefers Republicans over Democrats. Maybe that will change because the energy sector in itself is changing as well. And oftentimes, you probably know, as you look at the chart in the middle, lawyers tend to give more money to Democrats than they do to Republicans. Now, here is the breakdown in the amount given or donated to elections versus the amount spent on lobbying. And almost 2-to-1 in the 90s was lobbying to elections. And that has almost grown equal in present time. Let's say, who spends the money? Who's donating the money? Well, once upon a time, it was the old guard. The old guard meaning the candidates themselves and traditional PACs. Traditional PACs that had more limits on them when it came to donating and spending. Today, we're seeing new players. We're talking about nonprofits and super PACs. And I must add that both sides availed themselves of the new decisions by the Supreme Court. It's not a one-sided situation. The old guard had limits on the amount of monies raised and the way they spent their money. Specifics, you could not have unlimited spending on the part of unions, nor even corporations. With the new legislation and the new players, there's no limits on the source or the amount of contributions on the part of individuals and or corporations, or unions for that matter. Now, you could once upon a time give money to candidates and PACs. Now you can make independent expenditures. What I mean by that is that once upon a time, you only gave money to a campaign and it had to be spent on the campaign itself. Now you can make expenditures that will benefit the campaign, but are not necessarily political in nature. The FEC received almost all the information on the spending. There was a tight grip. Now it's kind of Katie bar the door. The FEC receives very little information on how this money is being spent by the super PACs. The super PACs, as compared to the PACs of the old, have much less limitation put upon them. Now, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of this chart here, you see a little person in color. They represent the amount of money given 99% of the money given to contributions. So 99.74% of the people in the United States gave less than $200 each. The rest of the money given to contributions, the rest of the money was given by less than 1% of the people. So you're talking about corporations and large organizations that are giving the money, not the little person, not that tiny little person in the far right-hand corner. Give you a case in point. Most of the money, well, almost half the money in 2012 election for Obama, they came from just 3 states, 3 large Democratic controlled states. The 47 other states gave little in comparison. And by the way, it's not a simple solution. Once upon a time, if you outspent your opponent, you were certain to win. In 2004, certainly in the House, it was over 80%. And in the Senate, it was just about 80%. It has dropped. It has dropped in both cases, not precipitously in the Senate, but somewhat in the House. And I have an old student of mine who's running for Congress. And in a conversation I had with them, they said they had no idea of how much time they were having to commit to try and raise campaign dollars. I'll give you an example of a day of a member of Congress. So you're talking about almost half their time spent calling constituents, calling organizations, trying to raise monies. I doubt if too many of these people thought that that's what they were going to be doing when they arrived in Washington. So remember I said that we were going to be talking about nationalization? Well, if you are Salud Carvajal on the Central Coast, might it surprise you to know that he's receiving a lot of monies from outside our district, our congressional district. And it's often a charge that you hear from both sides in a campaign, that the campaign is being affected by outside interests. This is a trend toward nationalization. Let's go on to another subject, religious diversity. How does that affect polarization? Well, you do know that the amount of Christians in the United States is declining. You do know that there's a trend to less public confidence in organized religion. There's a controversy almost weekly that will cause you to lose confidence in religious institutions. And as a result, there's a whole group of people, which is rising in numbers. They're referred to as the nuns, not the N-U-N-S of Catholic fame, but the N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. Here is the decline of membership of Americans in churches, a precipitous drop, an almost 10%, well, more than 10% drop just in the last 20 years. Stark. And if you look at the number of people, the percentage of each generation who identify themselves as atheists, or those nuns, if you talk about the silent generation, people born in the 20s to the 40s, only 11% of them refer to themselves as nuns. But you contrast that with millennials, 36% of them say they have no religious affiliation. They are a nun. Here is how we break it down according to religion. So Catholics take a 24 to 16% hit, evangelical Protestants from 30% to 19%. But the unaffiliated, there are the nuns. They have grown from 11% to 36%. Huge, huge on either side. And it would not surprise you that even the proportion of seniors has grown in the last 7 years. And if you're talking about, well, who actually goes to church? If you're talking about the two parties, the people who attend worship monthly in the Republican side is almost double the number of Democrats. And likewise, the number of people who never attend worship, double the number of Democrats as opposed to Republicans. So it's almost come to the point where if we know how you practice your religion, we can probably make a pretty good guess as to how you are politically affiliated. So the nuns are now more numerous than Catholics, evangelical Protestants, and even members of the Black Protestants amongst Democrats. Whereas today, Christians are overwhelmingly Republican. And this leads us to a knowledge of where people stand on the issues such as gay marriage and abortion. And it's interesting, the latest news in San Luis Obispo is we are now going to get our own Hobby Lobby. And it's going to be situated, what, less than a block from a hobby store we already have. So it'll be interesting to note how they succeed in liberal San Luis Obispo, even though Hobby Lobby has a history of opposing gay marriage and abortion. Here's how the groups voted. As it will probably not surprise you, the Protestant vote was big on behalf of Trump versus Biden, and the unaffiliated vote, let me move my face here so you can get that number, 70% of Democrats, or 70% of the unaffiliated voted for Biden versus Trump. They're both majority Christian, by the way. That's not to say that Democrats are un-Christian, but 7 in 10 Republicans identify themselves as white and Christian, compared to less than 4 of 10 Democrats. Almost a quarter of Democrats are unaffiliated. Only 13% of Republicans are unaffiliated. Again, the nuns. So it's a homogenous group, Republican Party, whereas the country has become diverse, the party has not. And here I think is an interesting quote. In terms of racial and religious diversity, self-identified Democrats look like a 30-year-old America, whereas Republicans look like a 70-year-old America. For those of you people who are conspiracy-minded, you think, aha, this is why it's becoming more difficult for the young and the underrepresented to vote, because they feel like there is a trend. I'm saying the right feels like there's a trend that is not in their favor, and they're trying to put hurdles in the way of that trend. So say the conspiracy-minded. Let's speak about the racial and ethnic diversity. Here are the population trend in the United States. And you can see where it was a largely white country in the 1970s. And if we can look, I'll move my face again. If we look again into the year 2050, whites will be in the minority. It will happen as soon as 2050. It will be close in 2040. And here is the trend that concerns those on the right, in that here is the population increase, the increase of Democratic voters in comparison to the increase in Republican voters is greatly in favor of Democratic voters. Overall, there's been an increase of voters, but the Democrats have gotten the advantage in this comparison. Here is the way it's broken down by race, in that Republicans still lead amongst white voters. Huge advantage to Democrats when it comes to voting amongst Blacks. Here is the subject of so much discussion today, in that depending on who you read, Democrats are supposedly in trouble with Hispanic vote, but you couldn't tell it by this graph here, in that still 2/3 of Latinos will vote Democrat. Also, Democrats have the advantage in the Asians, and if you are anything other than Black, Hispanic, or Asian, you're also going to probably vote for the Democrats. So they have an advantage in all but the white category do Democratic voters. So white, black, Hispanic, Asian, other. Now, there are a lot of people who say in the long run, diversity is a good thing. In the short run, because of social distrust, and we define social distrust as the belief that we can understand and count on one another, it's not a good thing. And as a result, there'll be more conflict. There was a survey which asked Americans, will it strengthen American customs and values? If you talk about the combining of all American people, no, the majority of people say it will not. It will weaken 38% of the people in this case here. But I guess if you add it to, well, it won't have much impact, it won't. Well, it will be kind of a non-issue. But it may not surprise to you that Republicans will say that it will weaken. Large majority of them will say that it will weaken, whereas Democrats say it will not. It is a good thing. How about, will it lead to more conflicts? Again, all adults will say that there's going to be, let's see, 26 and 23, 49%. It's a draw. It's a draw as far as conflict between racial and ethnic groups. But when you're talking about Republicans only, there will be more conflicts if you ask them. Democrats are, interestingly, not too far behind. Here's some good news for you. In the year 2001, there were 63 combined members of Congress who could be referred to as racial or ethnic minority. A scant 20 years later, that number has ballooned to 191. 191. So certainly the facts prove that there is increased diversity in Congress. Here is the age factor. Here's the age factor. The percentage of people in the population. We are an aging country. We are an aging country. The dark color continues to increase, representing the adults 65 and over, whereas children under 18 continues to drop, continue to drop. And if you look in the far bottom right corner, you'll see that the number in millions of children under 18 is going to lag by 14 million people in the year 2060. We'll have the same problem that they are experiencing in other countries like Japan, for example, where the populace is quickly aging. Here's that term again. Just thought it would be used as more than one use. Democrats look like a 30-year-old America, Republicans like a 70-year-old America. Another subject, another issue, a reason for polarization, pointed out by both authors, well, three authors, the passing of the greatest generation. And it's all about values. They're under fire that their values were forged. They could be considered to have a willingness to sacrifice for their country. Also, they see the bigger picture, and they have stronger character, and also to a shared civic faith. And I guess the big difference is that their generation was developed by external challenges, whereas recent generations are shaped more by internal challenges and culture wars. The baby boomers developed their identities by fighting not a foreign enemy, but by fighting each other. And that's why you get that us versus them mentality. I guess you know that the Duke was very much a conservative, but in 1960, he was famous for a quote upon John F. Kennedy's election: "He is my president," and he has well wishes for him. We fast forward to the year 2000, well, into the 21st century. Here's another notable. Maybe it's an insult to put him in the same category as Mr. Wayne. I hope he fails. And I don't think you'd have any shortage of people on the left who had the same sentiments for our president elected in 2016. How about how we are separated by geography? Well, the authors in the two articles both said, hey, you tend to congregate, you tend to live with like-minded people. In another book, like-minded company polarizes. Heterogeneous communities restrain group excesses. Homogeneous communities march toward the extreme. You probably have seen maps like this. And here the author comes up with their own names. You are residents of the left coast. And if you go even into the valleys of California, you leave our states, these mythical states, and you are now into the far west. And as you gather east, the Midlands, El Norte, Greater Appalachia, the Deep South, Spanish Caribbean, and they're almost like separate countries. And they are bound by commonalities in politics. The word landslide refers to someone who wins an election by a large amount. And if you live in a county where one party has a huge advantage, then of course it's referred to as a landslide election. And in 1976, 25% of the counties in the United States could be referred to as landslide counties. In the 21st century, that number has increased to 60%. So to look at it the other way, there's only 40% of the counties in the United States which are contestable. If you're looking at another divide, also based on geography, the cities versus the farms. And it would not surprise you that they have different interests and values. Democrats used to be the party of the farmer and of the rural inhabitant. That's changed now. Now it's become the urban party, whereas the Republicans speak for the rural demographic. And it's become more religious, patriotic, and family-oriented. I think anecdotally, you probably had a lot of discussions with people leaving California. They're leaving for places like Tennessee and Texas. And they report back to me and they go, oh, these people have such a great emphasis on family, like I guess Californians don't. If you're unaffiliated, on the religious side, you tend to come from the Northeast and the West, whereas if you're deeply Protestant, white evangelical, no surprise, from the South and Southern Midwest. Here is the vote. This map represents the vote in 2020. The big surprises here were Arizona and Georgia. they are represented in blue, and they represent the urban and rural divide as well. As the large cities of the West and the East, they will often determine the vote in those areas being Democratic. The heaviest concentration of the Republican vote is in the Midwest, as noted. This gentleman will bring the point home.
The urban-rural divide in this country is as stark as ever. Think about it, it's almost always the case. If you live in a big city, you're going to go blue by and large, and everything else is red. In fact, I cross-checked the numbers and found of the top 50 most populated cities in the United States, only 2 went for Trump. Just 2, Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Oklahoma. In fact, when I put this up on Twitter, the mayor of Oklahoma City reached out to me and even said that he thinks Oklahoma City was blue, but it was small portions of the outlying county that made it red. I took it a step further and found of the top 100 most populated cities, only 9 went for Trump. It's not hard to find glaring examples of this. Utah and Nebraska, for example, blue big cities in an island of conservative red rural counties. So what is with this? Why is it happening? It's changing our politics altogether, and it's actually rendering the Electoral College almost totally useless. The urban-rural divide's been happening for decades. Look at 1976. Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, took the South and the rest of the map was red. 1924, Calvin Coolidge won with every state except the southern states. It's basically flipped. It's the opposite now. Democrats have gone from the party of the farmland to the party of big city. So these things change. It's not people making cities liberal, it's cities making people liberal. William Frey, a demographer for the Brookings Institute, suggests a couple of things about this. He's been digging into it and finds as we become more interconnected, universities attract more diversity, and with more growth comes more people, and particular professional, educated people with diverse backgrounds, which basically is now lockstep with the Democratic voting bloc. I spoke with U.S. Senator Jon Tester from Montana, who knows this really well. He's a Democrat in a red state from Choteau County, Montana, which is, you guessed it, solid red. He drills into this urban-rural divide in his new book. Tester puts a lot of the blame squarely on Democrats and says they're just not doing a good enough job of getting their word out to the rural folks.
We may be Democrats, we may be Republicans, we may be independents, we may be libertarians, but we're all Americans first.
Tester takes a very Montana approach to this. It's a cowboy state. It's all about finding common ground. Your handshake is your bond. I actually know Tester. I covered him in his first run for U.S. Senate. It's a simple way of thinking about it, but it's effective. Respect both sides and find common ground.
We have far more in common than we have to divide us. And I think we need to keep that in mind moving forward. There's so much focus on division right now, and I don't think it's healthy. We should be focused on what unites us and work off of that common ground to make this country, or keep this country great.
It's just a refreshing way to think about life. Respect each other no matter what color we are in life or politically.
Let's jump to immigration. You probably heard this before. Immigrants strengthen the country with their hard work and talents. It was the subject of that survey we discussed before. And I think we also pointed out that there is a difference in who supports that statement. Here's our friend at Pew Research Center, who says it's almost double the amount of Democrats who believe in these statements as opposed to Republicans. When it comes to the issues in Q3 of last year, immigration is still an important issue amongst Democrats and Republicans, but not as much with Democrats, because the farther right you go, the less important it is to a certain parties. So it is a much more important immigration issue to Republicans as it is to Democrats, much more important. When you're talking about what is on the minds of Democrats, it's voting integrity, whereas it isn't a concern on the part of Republicans. Democrats are concerned about climate change, healthcare, and minimum wage. Not so much Republicans. Again, if we're just zeroing in on immigration, there's different sub-issues of that issue. We're talking about security of the border. It's a much bigger issue than let's increase deportations. And I think what this chart tells you, that if you're going to be discussing the topic of immigration with someone of the other side, it would be safer to start with deportations or to take in refugees. But not a good starting place if you're going to be talking about security along the border, because it is much more a fractious location of that issue. How about, let's establish a way for immigrants here illegally to stay legally. You're not going to get much support from Republicans on that, whereas down on the bottom left-hand corner, you see that more Democrats would support that statement. Well, let's take in refugees escaping from war and violence. Again, let's revisit that part of the issue. Again, you don't receive that much support from Republicans as opposed to Democrats down below. Let's talk about the media. They always seem to be the punching bag of both sides of late. How do they affect polarization? Well, if you know the history of newspapers, it would often be the ploy of a rich person to buy a newspaper, and then that newspaper would be the mouthpiece of their values and their goals. So they don't have a pristine reputation in the past. But what happened is that television was where people were getting most of their news. And as a result, we trusted information from 3 national television networks. TV, do we still have a TV guide? I haven't seen one in a long time. You'll have to tell me. Here is an issue that spotlights are for anchormen. Because if you remember, one network shared the desk. For CBS, it was Uncle Walter Cronkite. For ABC, it was John Chancellor. And NBC turned over their news desk to Huntley and Brinkley. What they said was the gospel, and it was just part of Americana to watch the news after dinner as a family. Trusted individuals. But to be fair, there are only 3 outlets at the time. Okay, all that changed. Cable is born in the 1980s, and the internet comes by in the 1990s. Now you have hundreds of choices. I remember going to an early Baskin-Robbins with a friend, and they were overwhelmed by the choices. And at the end, they choose vanilla because that's what they were most comfortable with. Well, I think that might happen to a lot of us when it comes to the outlets. And now you can live in a media ghetto. Now that might surprise us when we use that term, but all that means is that you live in an enclave of like-minded people in the same situation. And you end up with people that you already agree with. You're hanging out with the choir. And consequently, there's no challenging of ideas, very little, and they're made oftentimes more extreme. You end up with partisan talking points. I think you find that in your conversation the next day. You use, if you're still arguing with people, use those talking points mouthed by an anchor that you heard last night. Because we're always privy to the exaggeration. It doesn't give you points on the media scale if you are a moderate. So it's a thing called confirmation bias, which means that people only go out for information that confirms that which you already think. Confirmation bias. So if you are looking for evidence about a conspiracy, then it's no matter to go on Google and find evidence for that conspiracy. But how many of us will find evidence that that conspiracy does not exist? So consequently, we have extremes, and it's the people that are the noisiest, the most outrageous, and the most polarization who are the most popular. Let me share this with you, a cartoon. I guess you're looking at a Jeopardy model. Sorry, Arthur, your answer was actually correct, but Paul shouted his opinion louder, so he gets the point. And an extra bonus point also goes to Sue, as she was offended by your answer. It's a representation of both sides, right? Now, what's interesting is that our friends at Pew again came up with an interesting finding that if you are liberal, you're going to have a choice of outlets. You're probably going to converge on the opinions of CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and New York Times, whereas the vast majority of conservatives will zero in on Fox News. Shocker. Okay. If you ask people who are watching cable television, the question, what do you think is the biggest threat to the United States? The likelihood of it is that it's the other party that's the biggest threat to the United States. How about this for a busy chart? Now, I'm going to be presenting this live next, well, probably already have done so as you're watching this recording. And they're going to go cross-eyed if they try to take this in all one time. So I break it down for them. This is by a group called All Sides. And they change this from time to time because some of the outlets sometimes tend to waver, left or right. So if we're talking about the left side, some of these people you haven't even heard because they are to the far left, and maybe you find yourself being a moderate. Again, the confirmation bias. Remember Adriana Huffington? Her husband ran for the Senate in California, beaten, and she was a controversial figure. She started Huffington Post, later on became Huff Post. She's since sold, but if you want to hear the opinions of the far left, these are your alternatives. Might I point out that you're going to find the New York Times used more than once here, but it's the New York Times opinion page, which is referred to as far left. Here, top right-hand corner, you see again New York Times, but it's their news pages, which that this concern determined that they were not far left, they were moderate left. And you'll notice that the major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, are all referred to on still leaning left. And NPR, most people say, wait, NPR, they are very moderate, very nonpartisan. But when they share their opinions, they tend to be more left. If you're looking at someone in the center, now it's NPR News. If you want to hear more of a nonpartisan side to the news, then it's NPR News. A favorite of mine, I don't read it anymore, but for a long time when I was in college, it was the Christian Science Monitor, because I thought that they were very nonpartisan. As it turns out, according to these people, I was correct. The Murdoch people bought Wall Street Journal, so you would think it would be on the right, but no, their news pages are referred to as still being on the center. And if you're getting your news from Reuters, it is also considered to be non-partisan. Now we go farther right. See, now the Wall Street opinion pages, they are on the far right. And not to be confused with the Washington Post, you get the Washington Times and the Washington Examiner, they are on the right. One of the newer outlets, Newsmax, they are on the far right, but not the farther right, not the farther right. Now, if you're looking extreme right, It's Newsmax opinion and New York New Post opinion. They are on the far right. So is the newest of the new, I think it's One American Network, OAN, bottom left-hand corner. And probably not surprised by the fact that Fox is amongst this group. And if you find all these, with the exception of Fox, foreign, then perhaps the reason is because you are not in their demographic. Why has journalism gone downhill, according to many? Well, it's because of decline in standards. It was the opinion of these magazine articles and the opinion of many people. Because what has happened? You no longer have professionalism. Such a thing as editing and fact-checking has gone by the side, say the pundits. Once upon a time, you worked your way up. There was a credentialing system, a pecking order, and that increased professionalism. Not a problem anymore with digital, because if you have an iPhone or an Android, you can automatically become a news person. If you can take a photograph, anything that gains the views and the clicks makes you a journalist. And that's replacing the old system. It's become atomized. And oftentimes there is no head of the snake. It's largely leaderless. Okay, so what happens is you have now poor quality and repetition and non-facts. And I found it interesting that Fox was sued, and the defense of one of the lawyers is that, well, even-minded person would not consider this to be the truth. This person is just an entertainer, not a journalist, and they're not to be taken seriously. That was their defense. So the whole loss of journalistic integrity means that we now have polarization. All right, it's deep. It's dark. Maybe it's bummed you out a little bit. Is there a way to turn this around? Well, I brought in some guests today, and hopefully they'll shed some light on this subject, and they'll give you some hope.
20, we also need courage, the courage that it takes to have a difficult conversation, to put yourself out there.
What we've been saying is that this year, it's not enough to call in our better angels. We have to call in our braver angels.
The name Braver Angels captures the evolving spirit of better angels. We have to be willing to summon the courage to see the best in the other side, see the best in our fellow Americans.
Courage means becoming a leader in your own community who's standing up for America, not just for your political party or your tribe or folks with whom you share an identity, but standing up for something larger that we can all believe in. If we can create a large enough movement that is clamoring for a more courageous style of politics, we can change the incentives.
That's something that can only be achieved through what we call patriotic empathy, this idea that your love for your country is demonstrated in your love for your fellow American. As braver angels, we're able to lean into that with courage and boldness.
It will make you feel like we can serve this place and our country can serve humanity in a way that is actually beautiful and actually does us justice.
This is not a left-wing movement. This is not a right-wing movement, but it is indeed an American movement. We still have it in us to be champions for what is right and what is graceful and what is decent here in the United States.
In this time of public health crisis, Braver Angels is taking its work online, hosting weekly online debates, virtual book discussions, concerts, skills training courses, and soon one-on-one red-blue conversations. As Americans stay home to protect their fellow citizens, Braver Angels is bringing us together in new ways and helping us find the courage needed to transcend our partisan differences and overcome this challenge. Go to braverangels.org, sign up to join our email list, and at the end of the day, try to treat each other with respect, empathy, and find the courage needed to talk to people, even if, and perhaps especially when, you don't agree with them.
braverangels.org. If you are brave, I would recommend going that route. But we're not done.
We have to work on our speech climate. In the business world, it's called speak up culture. In the academic world, it's called just basic openness to ideas. When you put people together and you want them to talk, of course, people have a lot of different goals and fears. Nobody wants to say something stupid. Nobody wants to say something that will get them into trouble. If you can create a really trusting environment in which we're all in this together, contribute your ideas. If someone says something and you think it's wrong, say so. That's going to lead to more innovation. That's going to lead to more progress. But what if you have an environment in which if I say something that offends anyone, they can report me anonymously to HR or some other entity? I'm going to think 3 times before I speak up. That's what we have on campus. In the bathrooms at my university, there are signs telling students how to report me anonymously if I say anything that offends them. So I don't feel free to speak up when I'm on campus. I can speak more openly off campus, but on campus, I have to watch myself. As one student said to a friend of mine, my motto is silence is safer. Just shut up and you won't get in trouble. Now, this is a terrible speech climate. A university cannot function if people are defensive in this way. So in universities, in organizations that value innovation, we have to not just encourage people to speak, we have to assure them that they're not going to be shamed, humiliated, or punished for sharing an opinion in good faith. Look, we have a culture war raging all around us. It's very easy to take offense. People are understandably angry. Here within these walls, we have to put that aside. We have to trust each other. We have to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And it's going to be good for all of us to do that.
My personal take on that is that perhaps your conversation should start with your friends, those people you are comfortable with. If they are becoming too extreme, you are the people who can talk them down. You are the people who they trust and they will listen to. But we're not done.
American society is locked in a culture war. It's impacting almost every sector of our public life. But this conflict is most acute in the realm of politics, where it now threatens our democracy. While some form of the left-right divide will always be with us, the perennial political contest between liberals and conservatives can mature into a more functional version of itself. Let me tell you how. America's hyperpolarized condition doesn't stem from a simple disagreement. Our national schism is being caused by an underlying polarity of values. It's therefore crucial to understand that polarities, like the one that is roiling American society, represent indestructible systems. In other words, the polarity between liberals and conservatives is not a problem that can be solved. It's a system that needs to be managed. Right now, this polar system is stuck. But by managing our polarization more skillfully, we can restore functionality to our politics and civility to our culture. People in the world of business have recently developed the know-how to effectively manage indestructible polarities, and this knowledge is extremely useful for our current political situation. Problems to be solved are usually a matter of good versus bad. But indestructible polarities arise when we encounter good versus good. That is, when different sets of positive values conflict, a kind of dynamic system emerges. Familiar value polarity systems include liberty and equality, real and ideal, mercy and justice, competition and cooperation, and even masculine and feminine. In positive polarities such as these, each side creates its own kind of value. Each side also depends on its polar counterpart to maximize its own value-creating capacity. For example, consider the polarity of liberty and equality. The only way to have complete equality is to eliminate liberty. Yet conversely, if we value liberty alone, gross inequality will be the result. So in order to have both liberty and equality, we need the opposing poles of this polarity to moderate and constrain each other in an ongoing developmental process. Put another way, when faced with an indestructible, permanently recurring polarity of values, getting the best of both sides means establishing a relationship of challenge and support. This involves working with a natural tension between the two poles to continuously true up both sides. When it comes to the political polarity of left and right, creating the kind of cooperative relationship that allows for both challenge and support doesn't mean supporting the other party's candidate. It simply means acknowledging the basic legitimacy of the other side's bedrock values. Even if we disagree with their programs and policies, we can show conditional support for the other side by better recognizing the good they're trying to do, even while we resist their pathologies. And if we can't see any good on the other side, then we need to look more closely. However, when we look beyond our opposing interests to see more deeply into the bedrock values of our opponents, we can begin to recognize the inherent interdependence of liberal values and conservative values. And this simple act of acknowledging the interdependence of our respective values can establish the kind of political environment in which our respective challenges to each other can be more effective. Skillfully managing the polarity of liberal and conservative values, however, is not simply a matter of meeting in the middle or seeking a static compromise. Working to create a relationship of challenge and support with our political opponents represents a new approach to politics, one that is pragmatic and transformational at the same time. The only way to restore functionality to our democracy is to effectively grow out of the hyperpolarization that is poisoning our politics. And to grow in this way, we need to expand the scope of what we can value, both collectively and individually.
The bottom line from these articles was that some of us have greater tendencies to polarize. Some of us have an idea of what we're doing. My favorite saying from my favorite teacher was, "Blessed are those who know not, but know they know not." And these habits are always going to be with us. And that includes you and me. And it's overwhelming sometimes as we look at the national polarization. I guess my bottom line, is not terribly deep, is that as an individual, we can temper our own problems with polarization. So if you have your own comments, your own 2 cents, here is my email address. I welcome any comments, any suggestions. In the future, I want to leave you with my favorite philosopher, Eeyore, and his thoughts on the subject. Thank you for your attention. Hope to see you in the future.